Riva, who passed away on the 21st of September at the age of 81, was born in South Africa to Jewish parents who had fled what is today probably Lithuania in Tsarist Russia to escape the pogroms against Jews. They fled to South Africa, as did many Jews, including my own father's family. And her parents were politically very progressive. They actually met at meetings of a very sort of young and emerging South African Communist Party, which, you know, many of them coming from Russia. Many Jews were involved with communist movements. It was the sort of place that they would socialize and organize politically. Her father was a GP, a doctor. And interestingly, because he had been a member of the Communist Party, which is a huge political ally of Mandela's African National Congress, and was at that time, and was actually responsible in the liberation struggle against apartheid, was really responsible for ensuring that the ANC became a non-racial or anti-racist organization, so that it had membership of all communities in South Africa, all races, in a very obviously racially divided country. And her parents were very involved in that struggle. During the Second World War, because of his membership of the Communist Party, Riva's dad was in an internment camp in South Africa because they assumed he would support the Soviet Union, which it's never clear whether he did or not. But the extraordinary thing is he was in that camp with people who had been interned there because they were Nazi supporters. And these were the people who, of course, came to rule South Africa after the Second World War and who started the legalized system of racism that we know as apartheid. So people like B.J. Foster, who was the most brutal, murderous justice minister of apartheid South Africa, who had a trade union colleague of mine thrown out of a 10th floor window because of his involvement with the ANC. So they murdered him, and he was involved in many murders of anti-apartheid activists. He then became prime minister. And Riva's father was then released from this internment camp in the mid-1940s. And she always said, she wrote a beautiful memoir about her family a few weeks before she died. And she said that, you know, she doesn't think her dad ever recovered from that experience. And then when he came out of this internment camp, he was given what was called in South Africa under apartheid a banning order. So this was people who supported the ANC in the liberation struggle. They were confined to their homes. They weren't allowed to be in a room in their own house with more than one other person. So they couldn't even interact with more than one member of their own family, let alone meet friends or have meetings or anything like that. And they found that very difficult, unsurprisingly, and they fled to the United Kingdom. And they lived in West Hampstead, and their home really became what we in the ANC during the liberation struggle described as a safe house. So when ANC people were passing through London or were on the run, as Mandela and others were at various times, they were given safety and a bed and food at the Joffe's house. And Riva, as a consequence, through her teens, you know, rubbed shoulders with all of these giants of the struggle against apartheid. And her family remained committed to that struggle even while in the United Kingdom. And I mean, she talks about the joy that she felt in 1994 when South Africa eventually became a democracy. And Riva, you know, so Riva has been an anti-racist campaigner from sort of her early teens and has rubbed shoulders with some of the greatest anti-racist liberation fighters the world has ever known. And she became very active politically. She was a very well-respected and loved psychotherapist in North London. She became very involved in Labour Party politics, but also in extra-parliamentary politics in support of anti-racist struggles everywhere in the world. So, you know, she used to speak out about human rights abuses, be it in apartheid South Africa, be it in Saudi Arabia, where massive human rights abuses are committed on the Saudi population, the killing of innocent civilians in Yemen today, and various other things. She would always be speaking out on these platforms. And unsurprisingly, you know, as a Jewish person, she would also speak out and be critical of the Israeli government and its illegal and very brutal occupation of the Palestinian territories. And, you know, when I joined the Labour Party in 2015, the first meeting I ever went to, there was sat Riva. And, you know, she immediately embraced me as a South African colleague and comrade. And we spoke at great length about her involvement, not only in the anti-apartheid struggle, but in a wide variety of anti-racist struggles. And it was an extraordinary thing for me to have somebody like that round the corner, quite literally, who I looked up to as a veteran of our struggle. You know, I was obviously quite young in the struggle against apartheid, and I was a very young member of parliament under Mandela's leadership. But then, and you know, Riva was very brave. She had her principles. She would not tolerate any racism or discrimination of any sort. And I related to that, and I identified with that. But of course, unfortunately, you know, under Keir Starmer's leadership, and remembering that Keir Starmer is our constituency MP, progressive Jews or anti-racist Jews have actually become a target of the Labour Party. And just a few weeks before Riva died, she received a letter of suspension from the Labour Party, alleging that she was anti-Semitic. Now, you know, for someone as proudly Jewish as Riva, to call her anti-Semitic is just completely and utterly absurd. And it attempts this very reactionary political maneuver, which is to claim that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism, which of course is an absolute nonsense. You know, in my work, I research the global arms trade. I'm incredibly critical of America, the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Russia, China, and of course Israel, which plays a great role in the arms trade. Being critical of Israel doesn't make me anti-Semitic, just as in being critical of Saudi Arabia, which is a Muslim state, doesn't make me Islamophobic. I'm married to a Muslim woman, and my children are half Jewish and half Muslim. And, you know, Riva was similarly, she was an internationalist. She criticized all human rights abuses wherever they occurred. But as a Jew like me, with links to the South African anti-racist struggle, she felt it extremely important, just as she spoke out about British abuses, to speak out about Israeli abuses. And, you know, as Nelson Mandela, who was my boss for many years, said soon after his release from jail, our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinian people. And to see, you know, a lifelong anti-racist like Riva being accused of anti-Semitism by a party that she was so deeply committed to in the last weeks of her life was absolutely tragic. And, you know, Riva being Riva, who was the most remarkably brave and clear-minded person right up until her death, she decided, because she was suffering from very bad health, and she made the decision that she wasn't going to continue with various treatments that would keep her alive. So she took the decision as to when she was going to pass away effectively, and communicated to those of us who were close to her personally and politically about it in the most clear-headed, rational, strong and courageous way. She responded to the Labour Party in the same way, you know, giving a very, very brief, superficial overview of her history and her family's history, and how absurd it was to call her an anti-Semite, and how, you know, who Keir Starmer thought he was. to label somebody whose entire, probably almost 70 of her 81 years was spent in fighting anti-racist struggles. Who on earth he thinks he is to label her in this way? And she stated quite correctly that it was more a reflection of the state of the Labour Party than it was about any of her views. And so, even in her death, being the person she was, she stood by her values, her principles, and her completely non-negotiable anti-racism of any sort that had been such a huge part of her life. And, quite honestly, as I thought about all of these things while I was writing the obituary that was published in the Camden New Journal, it struck me that my own former boss, Nelson Mandela, probably the greatest anti-racist leader of the post-war world, with no disrespect to Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and many, many others all over the world. But, if Mandela was a member of today's Labour Party, I really fear that because of his support for the Palestinian struggle, because of his criticisms of Israel, because of his support for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, which of course was so effective in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, I fear that he would probably be suspended from Keir Starmer's Labour Party if he was a member today. And this is the absurdity of the situation that we find ourselves in, that progressive Jewish anti-racists in the Labour Party are 5 times more likely to be suspended from the Labour Party for anti-Semitism than non-Jews. Now, this is clearly and palpably absurd. You can't claim to be fighting anti-Semitism by discriminating against Jews. And unfortunately, that's what the case of an extraordinary human being like Riva, some incredible comrades, Heather Mendick being another one recently, who are lifelong anti-racists, who are incredibly committed political activists. And this is the sort of brush with which they're being tarred. And what that is doing is it's actually undermining the very real and necessary struggle against anti-racism, against anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and each and every form of racism and discrimination. Because if you're accusing lifelong anti-racists of racism, you're probably letting actual racists get away with it. And that's what we're seeing. The Labour Party has never criticized the fact that one of the people who publicly called Jeremy Corbyn an anti-Semite, Margaret Hodge, that her family business was an agent for the apartheid state, for which she has never been called to account, for which she has never been asked to apologize by the party. And hundreds of BAME Labour Party members have written to the party about it and haven't even received the courtesy of a reply. So, the party is ignoring real and actual racism. I mean, Viktor Orban, the deeply anti-Semitic Prime Minister of Hungary, is invited to 10 Downing Street, and the Labour leadership say absolutely nothing about that. So they're completely ignoring the actions of actual anti-Semites and other racists, while purging lifelong Jewish anti-racists from their own party. So very sadly, it leads me to the conclusion, because I do intrinsically believe, as Mandela told us, you are either anti every form of racism and discrimination, or you are part of the racism problem. And at the moment, Keir Starmer's Labour Party, with the way it's behaving towards progressive Jewish members, is a part of the racism problem, rather than a part of the absolutely essential anti-racist struggle. And the last thing that Riva said to me when she wrote to me to say goodbye from her hospital bed a few weeks ago was, she said to me, continue this crucial and important work, because the reality of the anti-racist struggle cannot die with us. And it is in taking on that incredibly important mantle from the veterans of the most important anti-racist struggle of the post-war period, the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, that I think we need to hold to account the leadership of the Labour Party at the moment for what they are doing to Jewish anti-racists like our beloved Riva.